So welcome everyone. Delighted that you're here. This is, I think, one of the great days for Oglethorpe, the Liberal Arts and Sciences Symposium. I hope some of you had a chance to wander through our posters just to see, does anybody here do a poster? One. Okay, so you've cleaned up your poster and you're already made it up here. Well, congratulations. Just the enthusiasm and the passion for what you guys are doing is terrific. So thank you for that. So now we move to our keynote speaker, and we have Dr. Keib, who's going to talk a little bit about her research on fake news and how that connects to her discipline, to what students are learning in the classroom, connected to what they're learning outside of the classroom. So I asked my students on the first day of my class where they received their news. I'm sorry to say 10% of them said they don't watch news or pay attention to it at all. The 90% who did, 60% of those said that they received their news from Facebook. And that was pre-Mark Zuckerberg taking the stand. But yet, that is how they're getting their news, through their news feeds, which is exactly what Dr. Keib is discussing. So she is a native of Pittsburgh, and she went to Point Park University for her master's and bachelor degree. She was a TV celebrity for many years, on camera in both Pittsburgh and in Atlanta. She then decided to pursue a PhD at the Grady School of Journalism at the University of Georgia. And she has published a number of works dealing with social media and people's attention to social media. And I'm sure she will address some of those questions here. So Dr. Keib.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you for coming out today to discuss a topic that I think is relevant in all of our lives right now. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the topic, my research in the topic, and then hopefully we can have a little bit of a dialogue about what we feel is happening in this country and maybe some things that we can do or that we can think of that could possibly change some of what's happening. So, as Dr. Sharfman said, just a little bit about my background. I did finish my PhD at the University of Georgia, a great experience. Went to Point Park University, and I have worked in media throughout my career as a journalist and as a marketing executive. So I did a lot of digital marketing, on-air marketing, and a lot of writing over the years. So a really interesting background and some context for me when I approached this work. The reason I went and got my PhD is because I love teaching. And there were a lot of questions that came out in my career that, frankly, we just weren't really able to answer. And I wanted to investigate a lot more about that. So I was thrilled to have the opportunity to earn my PhD and now to share some of my work with all of you. So thank you. The first thing I want to do is sort of just bring up the idea of fake news. How many of you have ever been shared a fake news story, a false story from somebody? Just raise your hand. Awful lot of us in the room. And why do you think, anybody want to share why you think somebody shared that news? Did they think it was true? Alex?
It was definitely worded in a way that made it seem like really scandalous, like a big reveal kind of thing.
Okay, so there was something exciting or interesting about it. Yes?
It supported their point of view.
Supported their point of view. Excellent. Yes?
Influence. Trying to influence one side or the other.
Okay, so they wanted to create some influence through that. Excellent. I think we can all relate to that. You know, there were times that these stories appeared and we received them and we're wondering, what was this person thinking? And those are some of the reasons why they might have done that. But, you know, this idea of fake or false information has been around for a very long time. You know, since before the printing press, anytime anybody has had power or there's been a situation where somebody is in power, there's been a spread of misinformation, especially when people didn't necessarily know how to read or have access to information. This kind of false or fake information has often been shared. But the way it's being done today is a little bit different. Some of the examples that exist in our culture here, you know, the example of the headlines right on the Chicago Tribune of Dewey winning the presidency, which of course was not true. Harry Truman won the presidency. This was published early. The edition went to press before the actual results came in. And of course, an example like the War of the Worlds that, you know, communications students learn about and we talk about, the broadcast that people didn't understand was not factual information. It created a panic. There have been times in those two examples where there wasn't a nefarious reason for that happening. It was accidental, but what it did cause was credibility issues with the media. And right now, we're in a very interesting situation where some of the people in power in our government, including our president, throw around the term fake news for anything, to pertain to anything that doesn't agree with their opinion or their point of view. And that's not actually fake news. You know, something that you disagree with is not fake news. Fake news is information that's spread intentionally to cause people to have a certain belief or mislead them intentionally. So let's just put that out there right away. Fake news is not anything you disagree with. But that's the way it's used a lot now. And people are using the term fake news whenever they want to just disregard an opinion or an idea that doesn't fit into their belief system. So we're definitely in a different situation now. And I wanted to point out to you two examples of actual, the first one is a Facebook post. And I don't want to say that was intentionally nefarious, but that was a Georgia mayor, a small town in Georgia, right before the election. He posted on Facebook that Republicans were voting on election day and Democrats the next day. He removed that post pretty quickly, claimed that it was a joke. But that's an example of possibly somebody intentionally spreading misinformation, right, to sway the election. And the other story is one of the most commonly seen fake news stories that was out during the election, the idea that the Pope was actually endorsing Donald Trump. And we know since then that a lot of people not only saw that story, but believe it. They still to this day believe it. And so we can see that there have been times, including the Pizzagate example, where people, a gunman went so far as to threaten people and has since, of course, been arrested and found guilty of threatening people because of the false news that was spread around. So this has very real consequences in society. And people are clearly acting based on some of the information that they see. In fact, just to sort of summarize during the election, there were 115 pro-Trump fake stories shared 30 million times. 41 pro-Clinton fake stories shared 7.6 million times. And basically what it comes down to is about 3 stories read per American during the election cycle. So we know that there was an effort, whether it was from inside or outside or both of our country, to influence the election. So this is a huge situation. It's not unique to the United States. We know that in 2013, in Italy, they had a very similar situation where false information was spread, and they believe it impacted their election. But here in the United States, we protect the freedom of the press. The idea that there is a role in society for journalists to help us as a society understand the topics, have context for the topics, and to hold the powerful accountable so that our government is not doing things that we don't know about. There is a protected role of the press in the First Amendment. And so we hold that very dear in this country. And the whole world sees the massive spread of misinformation as a threat to society in general. The World Economic Forum, based in Switzerland, has said that this massive spread of digital misinformation is a threat to democracies around the world and a threat to society in general. So that's coming from a nonpartisan group, worldwide group. So this is definitely an issue that deserves more research. What is it about these stories that is allowing people or making people think that they should be sharing them or that it's okay to share them? And some people might say, well, news that comes from social media or online news, how much influence does it really have? So I pulled some data for you. In 2017, 2/3 of the US adults get news from social media. And the numbers of people who get news from social media increases among older, non-white, and less educated Americans. So there's an awful lot of people who their entryway to news is on social media. In addition, the more people use social media, you can see that it takes up a much larger part of their media and news diet than the other sources of information that they get news from. So people who consume news from social media get a lot of their news from that platform. In addition, they do something with it. They don't just consume news, they're acting on it. They're commenting on it, liking it, sharing it. So they're not just consuming the news. And when it comes to politics, you can see there 56% of the time people who receive political news are going to share it. So this isn't just something that's happening only on social media or only with a certain group of people. This is a widespread issue in society right now. And certainly since the advent of the internet, researchers have been studying what happens when people consume news online. And we know that when people look at news online, they do things like look at the appearance of the website to determine whether or not this is information that's credible to them. And we know that in less than 3 seconds, people are able to look at the visual layout, the source of the site, and reputation cues to help make their decisions. It happens extremely rapidly. In fact, that first impression happens in as little as 50 milliseconds. So we know from past studies that people are making these decisions very, very quickly. And the way that they make those decisions is using heuristics, or mental shortcuts. When they look at things online, they, over time, are able to have these heuristics that help them decide whether or not something is credible, whether or not they want to consume that content or do anything with it. So what I set out to do was to look at what specifically about content from unknown sources is leading to people's credibility decisions. So we had this situation where we knew people were getting information not just from established news sources, but all kinds of websites. So what about those unknown sources was there that people were using to make their credibility decisions? So what I did was I ran 3 studies and a content analysis to sort of see what they did when they saw that information from an unknown source. And I'm going to walk you through those right now. In the first study, we had 100 people in the sample, and we showed them an article from the New York Times and an article from an unfamiliar source, which we called My 11 News. So they saw the actual news content, and they answered questions, open-ended questions and Likert scale questions about the credibility, familiarity, and the newsworthiness of what they were seeing. And then we analyzed that. So what you see here is the unfamiliar source. It looks like a lot of news websites, but that was an actual fictional news website. It does not exist. And the New York Times is often used in research because it is so familiar and has extremely high credibility ratings. And then what we did was we asked them not only the Likert scale questions, but the open-ended questions, because again, we wanted to see if there was something different when people were looking at unknown sources versus sources that they already know about. Is there some way that they're evaluating it differently? So what we found by analyzing their responses, and we used automated keyword analysis, so we used a computer program to look at their responses, and we also hand-coded them. We found that really they're looking at the 2 sources of content in the same way. They're not evaluating those unknown sources. They're not saying, oh, I don't know this source, I'm going to look at this a little bit differently. There wasn't language or terms or processes they were telling us that were any different than the sources that they already knew about. And looking at both, so we figured that out right away. So looking at the total of everything that they were looking at, the most prominent thing that they told us about was the writing style. They were assessing the content, which is probably a good thing, right? We're happy about that. They were considering the source, which is well established in research. The source is something that they're going to consider. The ads on the page, the design of the overall page, and the pictures on the page. So we were now able to say, okay, these are the things that they're using in their credibility assessments. We also found out that the credibility scores for the 2 sources were really similar. So here you have the New York Times in a completely unknown source, and people were judging them as just as credible. So how does that happen? There's a source that they can't possibly have known about because it doesn't exist, and it's rated just as credible as the New York Times. Pew, the source that I was sharing with you earlier with the social media statistics, in 2017 did a study, and they found that 56% of people reading news online forget what site they saw when they're asked about the source of the news they just read. So we do know that people, when they're reading news online, are going from site to site and may just not remember what source they were seeing. But also, I had the feeling that there was another element, and that's newsworthiness that played out here. The New York Times article was a story about people locking down their cell phones when they were at events. And the fictitious site story was a story that was about the flu shot. So people rated that flu shot story as more newsworthy. So what that tells us is that if you've got a topic that people think is important or newsworthy, that adds some credibility to it right off the bat. So if you're creating false news about an important topic, like politics or something similar, people may automatically apply more credibility to that topic because it's an important topic. So those are some of the reasons why we think that that story was able to be rated as credible as the New York Times. And most importantly, we established that there isn't some secret process or new process that we're seeing when people look at content from news sources. So then we wanted to go ahead and look a little bit deeper at what was going on here with the cues and heuristics on the page. Because like I told you, people, when we look at content, we visually look at what's on there, and those things that we see, those cues help us determine whether or not it's credible, whether or not we should consume it, click through it, share it. And so based on the responses that people told us, we mapped 3 cues: the picture relevance cue, the ads on the page, the advertiser standards cue, and the content quality cue, to 3 existing heuristics. 3 mental shortcuts that we know people use when they're assessing content online. And we also really wanted to look at whether or not these heuristics were actually being used. And so we used a branding model that was developed by Drs. Balor and Sundar. Dr. Sundar, just to give you some context, really is probably the father of heuristics in our field and has done a lot of research and work on heuristics. So we wanted to use this new model that these researchers had developed that helped us not just use self-report, but go a little bit deeper through a prime and through really specially designed questions to see if they were actually using those mental shortcuts or were they just using those cues on the page. So we designed our experiments using this model. And then in this case, I wanted to see, okay, people told us this is what they're doing when they go to the website, but are they really doing that? So we used eye tracking to see where they were actually looking on the page. And then we designed our experiment again, showing them some news articles so that we could see what their responses were. This is an example of the eye tracking on the page. So you can see that they were looking at the things they told us about. And in this example, they were looking very carefully at the content. You can see that where the red areas are, where the concentration is, they were looking more at the content. So that gave us some information right there. And everybody in the experiment saw 7 versions of the same article. And they had to come to the lab, obviously, to do this. And they were primed or not primed, and we also had a control. So people were seeing one version of the same article. We asked them about credibility, and we also measured their attention. And what we found, you can see here again, on the left is the example of the article with some stock photos, and on the right is the article where the photos were not stock photos. So you can see a little bit of difference in where their attention was. So then we went and added up. You know, through the eye tracker, you can add up the actual amount of time they spent looking at it. And what we found, 2 things that really stood out. When we made the ads of low quality, and again, we manipulated all of these based on the things that people told us that they used in their credibility assessments. So when we changed the things to be low quality like they told us, people spent more time looking at those ads. They spent a little more time looking at those ads that offended them, right, or were things that they thought were low quality. And they breezed more quickly through the ads that were like the ads you see every day, right? But some of those low quality ads they spent more time with. And they, when it was a stock photo and didn't really add much to it, they went through that much more quickly. So those are 2 things that definitely stood out to us in this case. The other thing was really surprising that people spent or rated more highly the credibility of the content when it was manipulated to low. Which was surprising to us because we thought that by changing the elements that people told us signaled something being, less credible, that they would find it less credible. But that actually wasn't the case. And I think that one of the reasons for this is the manipulation that we did, and we resolved it in the 3rd experiment. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But what we did find is that yes, people were looking at the cues they told us they were. And that there was something on the page other than just the content. Those other cues were obviously providing indicators of credibility if people were able to rate that content as, as highly credible. And we also established that yes, the ads on the page and the pictures on the page do really indicate credibility for people. So we wanted to take this to a more representative US sample, go outside of college and really get at what the general public thinks about this. So we ran an online study with the US population to study their heuristics a little bit more. This is an example of what the web page looked like when the ads were manipulated to low. So you can see what I was talking about. The ads are the kind of ads that you would see on a clickbait kind of website, right? So this is where the ads are manipulated to low. Everybody in this study saw the same content. And what we did establish is when the content was of a lower quality, they did rate credibility lower. So this time we really feel like we got the manipulation right. I went back to that content analysis that I did in the very beginning. And what I had done the last time was I think I had omitted things that they told us were credible. And in this case, I made them look low. Like I added more spelling errors, and some of the things that they told me indicated low quality, like having an advertiser mentioned in the content, I added those in. So I think that the manipulation was probably the issue in the other experiment. And so here, when yes, it was riddled with errors, a product was mentioned, people did say, yeah, that's questionable content. So that worked out in this one. And we also found, this is really important, that people who read online more often rated credibility higher. So again, the more that people are consuming content online, automatically the higher they're rating the credibility of the content, no matter which manipulation they saw. So no matter what else was going on, if they consumed more content online, they found it to be more credible. So overall, from this, we were able to establish that the model did work, and we did have some successful manipulation by priming people to think about the heuristic, to think about the mental shortcut, and it did have some effect on credibility. So we do believe that people are using the mental shortcuts in real and meaningful ways when they're rating credibility online. So I don't want to get too deep into the model, but I did want to let you know that we do know from this work and from past work that this is really the way that people are evaluating online content. So what we see now is that if people want to spread false or misleading information, they can manipulate things on the page, have high quality writing, nice looking ads, or possibly no ads at all, good design cues, and people will find it much more believable. So even if the source is not something they are aware of, if everything else on the page indicates to them that this is good information, they're more likely to share it. And if you think back to the examples I showed you earlier, the Pope story and the Pizzagate story, besides the source, those looked just like news you would get from somewhere else. So we see a real issue here with design cues, simple things being done on a page that can influence people's ideas of credibility. So now we're left with, where do we go from here? If people can be duped that easily into sharing misinformation, or perhaps they do just want to believe it so badly that they're sharing it, how do we as a society combat this? What are the things that we can do? Mimic news can be so easily created to influence people. One of the things that has been suggested is that journalists need to take more responsibility in this. And we see organizations such as Tegna working to build in segments into their newscasts, and they've got over 40 television stations in the US. They're building in segments into their newscasts called Verify, where they verify whether or not a false story is actually false. They explain to the public how they fact check it, why they fact check it. And it's not just false stories, they also uncover stories in their own communities and verify them. And I think this is important for two reasons. Number one, journalists are even starting a conversation very publicly about fake news, right? So whereas people may not really want to educate themselves about it, the television station is taking time in their newscast to bring this topic out. And then of course they are actually verifying stories that are fake and are being shared around. A lot of other organizations exist right now that help us with fact checking around the world and here in the United States. Some of them have existed for a while, some of them are new in light of what's been happening. So there is definitely a renewed idea of what groups and organizations outside of journalism and outside of government can be used to help stop the spread of false information simply by providing good information and fact-checking information. And we also have some researchers who are working on things like algorithms to help uncover fake news so that work would be helped along for all of us. Another idea is digital literacy. And again, since sort of the beginning of the internet, researchers have been studying how people assess content online and how we can teach them to understand what they're reading online. So you see groups like the American Library Association, the National Institute for Literacy, even healthcare groups and civic groups helping people to understand. And a lot of these groups would have bring people in for seminars, provide them with checklists, look at the source, look at the about us on the page. But obviously those programs are not very widespread, and especially today when people have been using the internet for so long, they don't necessarily think they need an education in that. There's also been an effort to get this into our schools. There's legislation in California right now that would have schools building in digital literacy into their curriculum so that from a young age, students are taught to question and taught to think about the source of their information. So there are efforts in those perspectives as well. And a lot of people think that these social media platforms should be held accountable. We saw recently, of course, many of us watched Mark Zuckerberg's testimony or read about it. And there's also been a lot of good, write-ups online, op-eds, editorial pieces about, how much responsibility in our society do these corporations that are, let's face it, making money off of this fake news, the advertising of the fake news and the promotion of those fake news stories, how much responsibility do they have in this? So there's been a lot of discussion from those areas. But for all of you who raised your hands and you've been shared fake news, or you're sitting here now, thinking about the things that I've just told you, I think that there's a lot of smart people in the room, and maybe we could just take a few minutes to, instead of feeling like we're a victim of this or society's just going down here, maybe we could think of a few ideas that we think could be done to combat this. So I thought we could brainstorm. I know some of my students, we've discussed this, they're still here. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on fake news. And it can be even just repeating some of what I just said, something that you think might work or might not work. Who's got an idea? Yes.
So I just gonna have a question.
Sure.
You pointed to the advertising as something that people look at a lot to kind of judge if it's credible. or
Yes.
not. But one of the examples used was Taboola,
Mhm.
which I know like Taboola and Outbrain, those are kind of resurfacing and retargeting kind of advertisements that a lot of big publishers use
Mhm.
that I would even deem credible.
Absolutely.
So-
That's a very good point.
I mean, where's the kind of line drawn on like, educating publishers on what to put on a page where they need to make money?
And I do think that part of the results, hopefully, of work like this would be for publishers to think about that. Are editions of ads like that impacting their credibility, right? So yes, they're making money off that, but is that hurting their credibility? And I also think that, what we did is we put those ads high up on the page. A lot of times when you see those ads, they're much further down. They're certainly not above the fold. So we manipulated it in a way to make it more prominent, whereas a lot of those advertisers, I think, do take that money, but they don't put it in a highly prominent space. But I think that's something that the publishers do have to ask themselves. And we've been in a situation for years where publishers of online content, including mainstream news organizations, have to put their content online, but they've been unable to monetize it. So while we're seeing layoffs and cutbacks in journalism, they're trying to monetize what's going on the site. So they're kind of stuck in a situation. And frankly, those Taboola things are often regulated by their parent organization and not necessarily the local news organization. So I think that's a really good point and something that publishers need to think about. Yes.
I also have a question.
Sure.
In the first study with the familiar and the unfamiliar,
Yes.
was the content the same?
The content was different, and that's why we think that newsworthiness was a factor. Because the two stories, so if the newsworthiness of the flu shot story, which was on the fake page, was, we think, a factor in that for sure, right?
So-
But regardless of, everyone saw both stories. And they told us they look at the same things on the page regardless of the story.
What would be your prediction of results if they saw the same story, let's say of high topic importance like you were talking about, familiar and unfamiliar?
I really think it would be the same, based on the responses that we saw, and there were 100 people in that study, and I content analyzed all of their responses very carefully. I really think it would be the same, regardless of what the story was about. I think that the responses pointing to the design cues was so strong that it would be the same either way. Good question. Yes, Alice.
Sorry, this is another question.
That's okay.
But as far as talking about the Taboola and stuff and asking publishers, to think about sort of these things, are publishers that inclined to care about the advertisements that they have?
So I think that they will if they see their page views decline. If they don't see their page views decline, I don't think they're necessarily going to care. I think that what we've seen, especially recently, when news organizations are affected by the public speaking up about their advertisers, whether or not they should be advertising. There are advertisers pulling out because of something happening on the news website or news organization. That will happen if they feel like people are going to stop consuming it less. But I think that, what I experienced working in the media is that they're not overly thoughtful about the big picture. They're very focused on the day-to-day and like those page views. So for us to do research like this and show them, hey, by the way, over time your credibility is going to go down and your page views will decline if you do these things. If they were inclined to be educated to that way, over time they might realize that those aren't necessarily good decisions. But I don't know, honestly, that they're in a position right now, if the page views are increasing, they're finally getting advertiser dollars to really make a change with that. Good question. Yes?
Great. This isn't a question, but it's just a thought. One of the
Sure.
classes I'll be teaching in the fall is language and politics.
Okay.
And watching your presentation, which is very interesting, my thought is one way, something I can do early in the class is to have students say your assignment is to go out and find examples of fake news.
Okay.
And in that respect, just make them conscious and put effort into and make sort of sport of it.
Yeah.
And that way become more aware of it, and then we could have discussions about
Right.
how they found it and what forms it takes.
I think that's a great idea. Really relevant to what they're facing now, and certainly would educate them by bringing up examples of things that they may or may not even be aware of, right? That are false, misinformation.
So, thank you for that. Could you make a distinction between bias and fake? So, what fake, I think, is deliberately false, spreading out. Bias, which is also a thing, gets sent all the time, and bias isn't necessarily fake, but
Right.
it's biased.
Right.
Can you detect the difference, or can people figure out the?
I think that's a really good point, because I think that one of the big problems that we have right now is that, there's a belief that all news is biased, right? That every story that's out there is biased in some way. And as journalism professors, we teach students who want to be journalists that their job is to report the facts, right? The facts as they see them, to dig deeper and to get facts and information to back up what they're saying in their stories. And a lot of people will lump journalism with what they see all day on CNN and Fox News. And what you see all day on CNN and Fox News is programmed information to drive ratings that is oftentimes talk shows. They're talk shows. In fact, for any of you who were following, the Cohen story and the fact that Sean Hannity was represented by Cohen in some way, Fox News was very careful not to say that Sean Hannity is a journalist. And I think that that's one of the first times that we've seen a public discussion about the difference between the two. I think that the public does not discern when they flip that station on and they see Fox News or they see CNN, the difference between a talk show and an opinion show versus straight news. And so therefore, the news industry in the desire to get ratings and to program these shows that are exciting and sensational, they've blurred the line between opinion, not that it shouldn't exist and it shouldn't be out there, but opinion and actual real news and actual real journalism, because there really are two things. One thing that I think is hopeful, earlier in my studies, I did some research on whether or not people find credible more news that they get from a news organization or news and information they get from a peer. And the one time that people did believe and hold more credible the news organization was with a local news story. So I think that there is some hope there that, especially when things happen in our communities or we want to know what's happening in our own community, people do still turn to their local news sources for that type of information. And I think that we're seeing now, even with the local elections that are happening and some of the turnover in government and the efforts that people are making to get involved in politics, that relying on our local stations where we feel like we know the reporters or know the journalists and they're members of our community, that has some hope, I think, in restoring some of the faith in journalism, when people can make that actual connection to the person delivering the news. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but yes. Oh, I'm sorry. But yeah.
One of the effects that I find most fascinating in persuasion research is the idea of a sleeper effect, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, which is where people are presented with an argument and that they might not be persuaded by it initially, but then as time goes on, they kind of forget parts of it and parts of it stick with them. So they might forget the part that it came from a non-credible source, but the memory of the actual message might stick with them, so that ironically over time it has a bigger effect in a delayed sense than an immediate sense. And I'm wondering if there's do you know of any research on fake news and the sleeper effect, where people might initially dismiss it and say, I don't know what my 11 news is, that's ridiculous. But then, a few weeks later, they kind of, as you said, forget where the source is.
Right.
They remember what the sensational message was, and it ends up having this kind of ironic, large effect that's not immediate.
Yes, that has been studied, and I can't tell you the specific studies that I read, but that has happened, especially when you have a story that's shared as much as like the Pope story. It's when people see things in enough different places, in enough different ways over time, they do start to believe it just because there's a preponderance of information about it. It's the idea that if all these people are talking about it in all these different ways, there must be some truth to it. And I think that's why you still get so many people who will tell you that there's some truth to the Pizzagate story. I mean, it just came out again in the last few weeks. There are still people fighting that that's accurate. Because yes, there's so much information out there that it becomes ingrained. So I do know that there has been some work, but I can't point to it specifically. But I think that's definitely an interesting area of research. Thank you. Yes.
I have a quick question about the local news and trustworthiness. So I understand there's lots of local news because president brought up by one particular group, and they're sending synchronized messages all over. So how is this now affecting the trustworthiness of local news? Or is it just another example of the sleeper effect you're just absorbing and it's going into the population?
I think that's a really good point. That's a really good point, because what you're referring to is, the Sinclair broadcast group putting together scripts that anchors and reporters were expected to read, and had some good results with that. And having worked myself at news stations that were part of large groups, I never faced a situation where we were forced to read anything. I think that that's very scary, especially because people do trust their local news anchors more. And so to hear that person saying that can create distrust. The good thing that came out of that is that because people were so outraged by it and because the public talked about it, both on social media and in traditional media, that people are aware that that's not okay and they're questioning things like that. So I think that it is bad in that it eroded some trust for sure, but it's good in that it's asking people again to question the source and to question where things are coming from, certainly. Yes.
So in addition to all of the fake news articles that we've been seeing on social media a lot, one problem that's also come to light recently is fake profiles, where rather than imitating reporters and news websites, people are imitating individual people and offering opinions on things. Like we had, I know that on certain blogging platforms and things like Reddit and Facebook, there were instances of people imitating African American activists and things like that, and offering opinions on things like the election that sway people one way or another. Where do those fall under the umbrella of fake news, or is that another problem? Is that a separate problem entirely?
I think that anytime you have somebody using a public megaphone to spread misinformation, it would probably fall under the umbrella of fake news. Again, remembering that that term is one thing in research and sort of another thing to all of us. But yeah, I think anytime you have anybody now broadcasting a message to intentionally sway people would fall under that umbrella of people spreading false misinformation and false information. And again, this isn't new. People have tried to do things like that to imitate people for many, many years. What we see now as a difference is the ability of people to spread this information so quickly online. You can see how quickly misinformation gets spread on Twitter, gets spread on Facebook, and it's hard to rein that back in because once people do see it, they've seen it, and it adds to their overall knowledge base about a certain topic, and it causes them to question things that they maybe didn't need to question in the first place. So I think it's very dangerous, but not surprising. Not surprising.
Was there any? I just know, kind of from my own experience, you think about the students like coming up now and have always lived in this world of digital media. But then I think about like people like my aunts and uncles that also send this fake news around. And was there any difference in like the age groups in your studies, or was it kind of just across the board?
No, it was across the board. In the first two studies, we had college population because they needed to come into the lab. In the final study, the average age, we shot a little bit older so that we would get more people who are on all different kinds of platforms. And we also, because we did that, our study, we used Amazon Mechanical Turk, we got people who read news online more often. So we got people who use those platforms very, very regularly. But we didn't see a difference in age at all, and I did look at that. Yeah.
Going to one of the question on ideas, you just said something about responding to this question about bloggers and people who promote ideas on and you said public platform. I think it is really important to understand that those are not public platforms, that this is all privatized and people actually think it's public space. And the misunderstanding that everybody can just put something out there and it's public. Yes, it is, you can call it a misleading. It's a very limited space, actually. So I think if we could raise more awareness to that those spaces are not public, because in X country you couldn't blog this or say that, right? So I think I always run into this public space place, which I find absolutely horrifying that people think that.
Thank you. Yes?
I know we discussed the difference between fake and bias, and I think a lot of public officials now, especially to one side, are pushing that biased news or what they perceive as biasing against them as fake news. How can you combat that so people who listen to these public officials who've traditionally been in positions of trust for the public, how do you get people to understand that what they're saying is fake is actually just biased and not actually fake?
So we haven't had any brainstorming, but I will tell you one thing that I think is really important because I've come upon this. I've had good friends tell me everyone in the media is biased. And at first I listened to them and I thought for a minute and I thought, no, I'm not, I'm gonna speak up. I'm gonna say, hey, as a journalism professor and a former journalist, that's not really true. And let me explain to you why. And I think really what it's incumbent upon is it's incumbent upon all of us to speak up. And when we hear things like that, we need to say something. If we want to protect our democracy, we want journalists to be able to do good work. We want those people to be able to do work that protects all of us, that exposes things that are happening in our communities. We have to help them. We have to do our part. And part of that is speaking up and saying when people make comments, or when somebody quotes to you something that they heard that you know was biased. There are ways you can ask them. You can try to draw them out in the conversation so that you're having a dialogue and we're acting more as a community, right? That's helping each other move towards a common goal of preserving the journalist integrity, but also questioning things that we think are not right or could hurt our society. So I think really it's incumbent upon all of us. And in class, we've had good discussions in the multimedia journalism class about, and in my social media strategy and analytics class, where we see people using these websites to spread information. We've talked a great deal about our role when we're using those sites in speaking up. If you see somebody share something that is false, are we brave enough, are we bold enough to go on there and say, hey, I looked at that article and I'm not quite sure what that source is. Have you checked that? Because I've found some things that were that speak against that. So I think we have to be willing to put ourselves out there a little bit and be willing to speak up if we want people to understand the difference. And if we don't understand the difference, we can ask. You know, you can always phrase it as a question. You know, that article seems biased to me, but I don't really understand the context. You know, put that out there and see what happens. I mean, good conversations are happening now, I think, on social media for sure. And I think it's incumbent upon us to talk about it and not to just ignore it and say, oh, everybody's caught up in this bias right now.
So I just recently read an article, actually 2 articles about the Comey memos. And one was in the New York Times, one was in the Wall Street Journal. The one in the New York Times talked about how the articles supported what Comey had written in his book, etc. The one in the Wall Street Journal talked about how Comey was hypocritical in parts of it, and they somehow tied it into the Hillary Clinton emails. So, I mean, are both those journalists unbiased, or how do we interpret that? Because they're telling different stories about the same event.
I'm not familiar with those articles, and I don't know if they were on an editorial page
They were on both front pages.
Both front pages. So I think that probably what you're talking about is the context and the expertise of that journalist for that news organization. So when a news organization decides what they're going to cover, they cover it in a way that they feel best suits the needs of their audience, right? So the Wall Street Journal is going to cover something a little bit differently than the Washington Post. Is that what you said?
It was the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times.
The New York Times. They're going to cover that differently because of who they are as a news organization and what their brand is. And the reporter is going to do that also. So as to whether or not it's biased necessarily, I don't know that I would call that biased. I think that I would say those journalists are providing the context that their audience comes to them for. So yeah, you're going to see different opinions. And that's why the other thing that I think is so important is that we're not just reading one news site. We're going and we're reading the news site that we think we hate and the news website that we think we love. And we're getting our information from different places because there are different ways of looking at things. And one is not always right and one is not always wrong. And journalists do bring their context to the table. That's why we don't just go and read websites that are full of facts to get our information from. We rely on journalists to bring us context and tell the story in the way that we think the audience will benefit from it. And those two news organizations have different audiences. The same way you would see an Atlanta TV station cover something that happens in Atlanta versus the way the national news might cover it.
Right, thank you.